Welcome, everybody. I'm Roz Naylor. I'm the director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment, and welcome you to another one of our symposia series. This symposium is the penultimate one. We have one more in May 23rd. And these last two symposium are going to be a little bit different than the earlier ones in that we're going to be focusing on Asia, China today, and India and South Asia in May, and really the experiences that we've learned from those regions and what they mean for sub-Saharan Africa. But today, let me start with the introductions, and I want to remind you this is one of our distance learning activities where the audience is actually in Africa and South Asia as well. And so when we come to the question period, and we will have a long period for questions, please keep your questions short and to the point, because these other people will also be listening to your questions. So let me start with the introductions. And before I get started with the speakers, we actually have a special guest in the audience today, Prabhu Pingali, who Prabhu, as many of you might remember, if you've been attending this whole series, was actually one of our speakers in the productivity session, great session, but he's here today in a different role. He is the Deputy Director of Agricultural Development and Policy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And really, without Prabhu's support, we wouldn't be doing this whole series. And so it's really been great to have your support, Prabhu. We've known Prabhu for decades, from IRRI to CIMMYT to FAO to the Gates Foundation, and we're quite sorry to see him leave the foundation. Actually, this is his final month with the foundation, which is really sad news for us, but the good news is he'll be a colleague now. He's going to Cornell University, where he's taking a new endowed chair and running the new Tata Cornell Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative there, working in South Asia. And I would like Prabhu to stand and just acknowledge him and thank him publicly. I might even give Prabhu the first question today. So on to the introductions. We're really lucky to have Scott Rozelle, who's one of our colleagues here at Stanford, with us to talk about China and China's experience and the relevance of that experience to sub-Saharan Africa. Scott is the Helen Farnsworth Senior Fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute. He is a major player within the Center on Food Security and the Environment and has given us a lot of direction and a lot of leadership in that center, and also runs REAP, which is the Rural Action and Education Program, where he's working on issues of education and nutrition, which I'm sure will come into his talk today as well. Scott's had a long history, actually, here at Stanford. He finished his, well, he started at Cal. I don't know how you started at Cal as undergraduate, and then went to Cornell for his PhD, and then was an assistant professor here at Stanford at the Food Research Institute. Very valuable professor, and then they closed down the department, which was really too bad, so he went off to Davis, advised I don't even know how many dozens, hundreds of graduate students. I remember talking to you one time, you had 25 graduate students at one time. So huge load there, and then came back, luckily, to us as the Helen Farnsworth Senior Fellow. His productivity and contributions have been enormous. My office is actually right next to Scott's, and so I can tell you sort of firsthand, I don't think there's anybody at Stanford who works harder than Scott, travels more than Scott, laughs more than Scott. I mean, he'll be gone, and he'll come in, and there's this roar of laughter for, the whole time he's here, and then he's gone again. It's like, what happened? What was that all about? Half of it's in Mandarin, and so it's really fun to have Scott around. He's worked extensively in China. I don't think there's actually any topic that he hasn't worked on, especially with respect to the rural economy of China. And it's a joy if you ever get a chance to travel with him to China. His energy, I have to warn you, you've got to take a lot of caffeine or something with you because you won't be able to keep up, but he knows everything. He gets so much work done. Everyone's engaged. And so he now has this record that has been set. I think the previous record was Jay Lasine Buck, who was Pearl Buck's husband, as having the most interviewed the most farmers in China, and Scott now has topped that. I think maybe even doubled that by now. So when you travel around with him, you'll mention, oh, what's that tobacco plant? Well, we did a study on that, and he's done a study on basically everything. So it's really very fun to travel with him in the field. But substantively, he's working on rural education and nutrition right now, has also worked on many topics in the development field and the agricultural field, from biotechnology to rural finance, incentive structures for farmers, and value chains, and the list goes on, and it's very fun, and you'll get a sense of it from his talk today. Scott, as you can tell, is fluent in Mandarin and Chinese and probably Cantonese. But if he starts speaking Mandarin and stops speaking English, we'll wave our hands, get him back speaking English again. And apparently he's got a reputation for the best puns in Mandarin. And I know he sings karaoke too, probably in Mandarin. So who knows what he's going to do today with us, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. One of his great styles in communication, and this was where I'll end it, is actually in the direct contact with the premier. And we, at the Center on Food Security and the Environment, we'd like to do applied work, but really policy relevant work. And I think Scott is the most renowned in this area for us. Wally Falcon has also been. But every year, he and his collaborator, Jikung Wang, from the Center on Chinese Agricultural Policy, present maybe a dozen memos to the premier. Almost all of them get picked up by the government and get put into action. And it's that kind of translation from what he's teaching students in development economics to real action on the ground that's incredibly admirable. So, Scott, we're looking forward to having you with us today. The commentator is actually somebody who is also local to us, Alain de Janvry, professor at UC-Berkeley in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics, and also at the professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy. And Alain has, he's French, as you'll probably see, although the French accent's wearing off a little bit, Alain, I have to say. But he may speak to you in French for all I know. He grew up around the Paris area and did his first degree in agronomy, and then came to the States, did his PhD at Berkeley in the 60s, and I think that's history because he was so valuable to them. I think he was assigned as an assistant professor there and has worked his way up the ranks. He's also been on leave in many other locations, and his CV is so long it's hard to even condense it enough to give you a good sense. But when I looked through his CV recently, I thought, this is a man who's sort of a Renaissance man in the development field and in the economic theory field. Although he's best known for his work in development economics and agricultural economics and translates that into a way we can all understand, he's also worked from the micro to the macro area, does a lot of work on the political economy and role of states, institutions, policy reform, so forth. So he's very interesting, and I hope that some of this will come through in his talk today. I think Alain has worked all over the world. We were talking today about Senegal, Brazil, a number of other countries, and so he certainly has a lot of examples to pull into his presentation as well, even just as a commentator. Our challenge today is to keep these guys down to the allotted time, and I'm not going to take any more of their time, but it's so fun to have the two of them here. Alain, many of my students who are in the room have read the World Bank Development Report that was on agriculture and development, which Alain was the lead author with Derek Byerly. And that is a renowned piece which he doesn't get much credit for, but so many people read it and have taken lessons, including the major institutions on agriculture and development. So with that, I will turn it over. Wally is going to be the timekeeper, and I'll just say I'm so excited to hear both of your talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roz. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to be able to really think through this topic. Give me a chance to sit back and say, what is special about China's agriculture and its development? What role did policy play? And then really try to carefully think through, what are some lessons we can draw from this for Africa and for the rest of the developing world? I should say almost all this work is done collaboratively with Jikun Huang. He's by far the most productive, the most influential agricultural economist in China, and we've worked together for over 25 years now, and he's really one of the driving persons behind this. So let's just start. What's the ultimate goal of development and growth? Of course, we know what it is. It's to become a rich, modern, industrial nation, right? That's what countries are striving for. But it starts with agriculture, despite what the last speaker, Paul Collier, said. We tried working on agriculture, it didn't work. Let's forget about agriculture and move everybody to the cities and start from there. I don't think that's what most of the development community thinks. From Schultz and Miller to Johnston and Timmer and de Janvry and others, agriculture provides the basis for a sound, sustained economic growth, from giving people wealth, to invest in their kids, to finance the move off the farm, to finance the move. Who's going to move the people into the cities if they don't have the human capital and the physical capital to make that move for starting self-employed, and as a source of demand in early stages? So that's where I'm starting from, and I think that countries that want to become a modern industrial nation start with agriculture. And I think that's been a theme that's certainly worked its way through this whole series. So I want to start, I'm not going to do a lot about African agriculture. I want to start in thinking about African agriculture. And there's been some pretty good growth lately. I mean, there's been a lot of attention to it, but I want to think more sort of until recently, it's been the lost decades. Almost no agricultural growth, almost no off-farm income growth, almost no income growth, right? Now, I'm going to show you some pictures of some lost decades, and I'll come back and tell you why. So here's some pictures of 3 lost decades here. This is agriculture TFP, so productivity growth, right? So this is true rising of output for a given set of inputs, and you can see most of it's negative. If you add it all up, these dark decades of these 5-year periods, the productivity actually fell during the lost decades. No agriculture growth. New off-farm employment. So this is the transformation of going from rural to urban. There's the first decade, this is for the whole 5-year accumulated average. The first 5-year period in decade 1% of the rural population moved to the city, into the off-farm sector. Then there was negative growth. It went up a little, it went down. Almost no transformation of the economy during this lost decade. Annual rates of income, you can see it's negative, right? People are poor at the end of the lost decades than they were at the first, right? Truly no rural income growth. No agriculture growth, no off-farm employment, right? This is the dark days, and this is that we're talking about. So what the world's problem is, what we, USAID, the DFIDs, the Gates Foundation, the African governments, the academics in Africa and the US and Europe and elsewhere are working on, is we want to take these lost decades and turn them into 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10% growth, right? I mean, we want to, have these countries grow, right? And so the question is it possible? How do you do that? How do you take this long, extended period of stagnation and turn it into that? Is that sort of so far out of the realm of the possible we shouldn't even consider it? Well, these lost decades I was just talking about, they actually could have been Africa. But they're actually the lost decades of China, of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. China during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s had no agriculture productivity growth. Their productivity was less coming out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s than when they went into it. There was almost no off-farm employment growth during this time here, and there was almost no rural income growth. The average rural person in China was poorer in 1978 than they were in 1948, 1952. As a matter of fact. And so these were the 3 lost decades of China. They very much like the lost decades in Africa. And So then the question is was it possible after 3 of these miserable lost decades to launch a miracle? Of course, in the back of our mind, but think about it is this going to be possible for Africa and other places in the developing world? But I want to look at the case of China. So here's 30 years of stagnation. This is rural income GDP per person in the rural economy. You can see it's flat, it's 0, right, during this whole time here. Then it hits 1978, 1980, and 10%. China GDP per capita went up 20 times between 1978 and 2011. It took the United States from 1870, from the recovery of the Civil War, to 2000, to the year 2000, to grow by 20 times. So, stagnation, lost decades. Look at this, I take this as real hope, right? And so the question, how did that happen? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. And really, what's the role of policy? And then be thinking about these policies as China rolls them out. Not all of them are going to be applicable to Africa or South Asia, but let's try to take some generalities away from there. So I want to say how you had 0 growth in TFP for 30 years, 0 transformation, 0 growth of income, and it made China into what it was today. And I'm going to start with the record of the past, but I'm going to get through that very quickly because I really want to talk about the policy menu and the impacts that had, and really try to understand how it created that growth. Almost as important, I'm going to talk about what China didn't do. Okay, and I think that there's almost more lessons for Africa from that than there are for what China did do. And I mean, there's lessons from China. There's some things that China didn't do that they should have done that may be undermining their future growth, and I won't highlight a lot of that for here. And then we'll think serious about policy lessons. And I know Alain is going to tell you more about the lessons. He spent a lot more time in Africa. Much more than I have. So the record of China's past. So here it is. It's not 10%, 10%, 10%. That's GDP. Agriculture, though, has grown 5%, 5%, 5%, 5%, 5%, 5% growth rate through the whole 30 years from 1988 to 2010. That's extremely high. The population is growing in the first 20 years by 2%. It's down to 1% growth rate. So there's just a lot more food. There's a lot more food per capita that's being produced by this economy throughout this whole time. And it's growth everywhere. It's growth in grain. It's growth in cotton. It's growth in oil seeds. It's growth in sugar. It's growth in vegetables. It goes, so Roz introduced me. I spent 7 years at University of California, Davis, and I spent a lot of time going out and being beat up by California growers who found themselves in direct head-to-head competition with Chinese fruit and vegetable farmers, right? Is that we used to dominate the Asia-Pacific region for exports of fruit and vegetable. And you can see what happened. I used to say from 1978 to 2008, every 2.5 years, China added another California. They added another California in fruits and another California in vegetables during those times. Just this amazing transformation in all these sectors. And the entire structure of agriculture changed during this time. If you look on the left-hand side, there's 1980, that blue, dark blue there is cropping sector. I mean, Mao did grain, right? And a little bit of pork for the cities and basically nothing else. By the time we get to the end of the 2000s, livestock and fisheries accounting for most of the output of the agricultural sector. And so it's had these wrenching changes within agriculture. But probably the most remarkable change comes from a data set that Ji-Kun and I have collected every 5 years for the since 1885 when I was doing my dissertation, to 90, to 95, to 2000, on to 2005, 2010. we've collected a national representative sample of rural families and tracked their off-farm work. And so in our first sample in 1988, we asked them, for the last 5 years, what have you been doing? And what we found was, so 100% is 500 million people. Okay, so there's 500 million rural people between the ages of 16 and 65. And when in 1980, you can see the white there, 82% there are pure farmers. All they're doing is they're just subsistence farmers. They're gardeners. Their farms are so small. The black at the bottom they're rural people, but they're working full-time off the farm, right? It's like somebody living in Gilroy and driving into San Jose and working there and night going back. So there's only 4% there. By 2011, 90% of the households have at least one family member, son or daughter, working off the farm. 71%, so that's 350 million people are now working in the industrial sector, in the service sector, not in agriculture. So it's a real transformation that has been taken. Now, of course, where were they working? They were working in all those sweatshops, right? I mean, it's the one the NGOs basically demonstrate against. And indeed, they were making 30 cents an hour when they started, right? That's why the whole world's manufacturing base moved to China. But since the late 1990s, as demand has gone up and supply, actually the number of laborers has fallen, China's wages started to go up and go up very fast. In 2010, it was $2 an hour. Last year, it got $2.80 an hour. The projections is by 2025, it'll be higher than the US minimum wage. And so wages are rising very fast. Actually, there's a lot of, just thinking about this, I call it the China dividend right now, is the developing country out there that can set itself up to become the low-wage manufacturer of the world. What a time to do it, because low-wage manufacturing go up. I had a grad student who came here, a former grad student from the econ department. He was on spring break, which is Chinese New Year's, brought his daughter over here to go shopping in the United States because it's so much cheaper here than in China. We went, he had a long shopping list, about this long, and we were going up and down the rows of Target and Walmart, and I started looking at the labels on all the things that are being made, and guess what? Of the 26 things that were in his basket, 4 were made in China. I mean, they aren't made in China anymore. You go through Walmart and go look at it, and they're Indonesia, they're Bangladesh, they're Honduras, they're Mexico, and so that the world is changing from there. China now has the 7th highest wage rate in Asia. It's past the Philippines, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia, and China. China has the 7th highest wage for skilled labor. So things have changed so fast. And per capita incomes have risen for the rural. All except the poorest of the poor, this income comes from the off-farm sector. Okay, so that's the story. Now the question, of course, is what's driving that? What did the government, in particular, what did the government do to drive that? What role did policy play? And again, keep in the back of your mind, where are the lessons? Okay, so I'm gonna break them into very complicated. There's things I'm not gonna address, but I'm gonna break them into 3 parts: institutional reforms, market liberalization, and investments, just pure, flat-out investments by the state sector. Institutional reforms is, how do we give people incentives to produce? The last decades, right, 50s, 60s, and 70s, China's farmers were in communes. The land belonged to the party secretary that was sitting in the town somewhere. There were all of China, there were 40,000 communes. They were like a big town. Performance from the 50s and 60s and 70s, as we saw, the lost decade, nothing happened, all right? Then Deng Xiaoping came and took these 40,000 communes and broke them into 200 million farms. Okay? They were family farms. They were given to the family. They don't get to sell the land, but they get use rights of the land. The farm size was small, about 1 mu per person, right? So how big is a mu, right? How big is a mu? A mu is between the 0 and the 12-yard line of a football field, right? And so a family of 5, they got a football field of land, right? I mean, you realize in the United States, the average size is about 50,000 mu for the average farm size. So this is 5 mu per family. Now, you know, Jim Harbaugh and David Shaw ruined the best joke I ever had. Because it used to be the best joke I ever said was the best use of this Stanford football field should have been to produce crops for China and the world economy, right? Of course, 3 BS bowls in a row. You know, Alain, I am a Cardinal football fan. I don't root for the Bears anymore, so it's a fair weather fan indeed. Yes, exactly. So, okay, so, you know, they had the rights to choose crops, the right to the income. They had the incentive before, when they were referring to communes, is the output went to others. They got the income and the right to choose the crops and inputs themselves. And the impact was astounding. From 1979 to 1985, this is total factor productivity for rice, wheat, and maize. It happened for all crops. It went up by 50%. So just to make sure you understand what that means, it means that for the same number of people, the same amount of land, the same amount of fertilizer, the same amount of everything, output went up by 50%. Right? It came out of hard work. Okay, is basically what it came out of, and the economy boomed from there. I mean, you know, incomes, of course, now even more income went into the pockets of the farmers, and China was off. So this was the real key. Incentives really matter. Now, if you have a lot of output, but you can't sell it, or that this is going to matter also. I think what's much less well known is about China's commitment to market liberalization, or to using the market to guide decisions. And there was a huge policy agenda that sort of unfolded over the 80s and early 90s, where it used to be the state bought everything. They dismantled these, they called parastatals, or state-owned grain trading companies. They deregulated training rules. They invested in roads, invested in communications. So what was the impact of that? We got a hold of a very unique data set in the early 90s. Every one of those red dots there is a county, and every 7 days, the county people went out to the market and got the price of the main commodities in their markets, and then they call them to Beijing, and they tabulate them. So you can think of one particular market for rice, this whole string of prices on a particular day, and this was done the same day across China. So we can sort of see how prices move across the landscape. We can do a couple things with this. The first thing I did, we rearranged the data. We put on this graph, and we put the left-hand side, 0 is the 0 kilometers from the consumption center. So that's Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou. So this is where all this grain was moving to feed these big cities. And then as you go out there, you get out to the remote counties that are producing out in Sichuan or up in Heilongjiang, and that creates a transportation gradient, right? So it's what's the difference in the price that the guy who's producing out there in that market gets versus the guy who's eating it in the city. And if it's really steep, this market's not very efficient. The guy's getting a low price and the city people are paying a high price. As it flattens out, markets become more efficient. So let's see, it's the similar if we're looking at the difference of the price in New Orleans versus St. Louis or Minnesota. Here's the transportation gradient for the US corn prices in 2000, for example. And what we see from here is in the late 90s, the roads are in, the communication system is set up, everything's been deregulated, and the efficiency of the Chinese agriculture marketing system takes off. You can see over time for each of these commodities it flattens out, and by 2000 China's moving grain across the landscape more efficiently than the United States is. I mean, we have the most efficient marketing system of agriculture commodities in the world, except for China. We do it on barges down the Mississippi with union wage boat handlers and insured barges and paying canal fees as we come down. China puts 30 tons of grain on a 10-ton truck, and the drivers drive all night and arbitrage a penny or two away from the supply to the demand. And it's moving very efficiently. You can also see it by just looking at two markets over time. Guangdong is the consumption center in the south, and they're feeding lots and lots of corn to their hogs to feed all the consumers in the Pearl River Delta. Dalian is the port that's taking all of the grain out of the Northeast. And you can see in the early 1990s, throughout the 1990s, the prices certainly moved together, but there's times when actually the price in Guangdong is lower than the price up in Dalian. Now, why would that be? Well, the markets just weren't integrated. But after we hit 2000, you can see they're exactly the same. They differ by $13 per ton. And what's the price if you go to a website to move grain from Dalian to Guangdong? $13 a ton. It's exactly the transportation cost to get the grain from there. So these markets are very well integrated. We did one final, more sophisticated integration analysis. Remember, we had 40 markets in that map that we're calling Beijing every day. So if there's 40 markets, then there's 40 times 41 divided by, there's 800 pairs of markets. And in the early 1990s, only about 50% of the time, if the market price moved in one market, would it move in another, okay? But by 2000, within a 10-day period, 100% of markets were integrated. If the price moved anywhere, if the price went up a little bit in this market, traders in this market would then load their trucks up and race the grain over. This price would go up, that price would come down, and they'd stay perfectly integrated. This is an amazing, if you do this in the United States, it's not, you can only do it in the summer, because in the winter everything freezes up, but this is for all year round in China. So what's the impact of the rise of market integration? Villages specialized. By 2008, 60% of villages were specializing in a crop rather than growing everything. And what's the impact on the poor? I think this is a real lesson here. We ran a regression where we wanted to say, okay, let's think about all these households, and as markets rise, who's producing more cash crops, fruits, vegetables, high-valued crops? Who's producing more output, because that's area times yield, and who's getting more income from it? Area times yield times price. And if you go and run this regression holding everything else constant, we're interested in, are the poor benefiting from this? And what we find in all of these things is the poor farmers end up producing more cash crops, producing more output, and earning more income from it. It's a very pro-poor activity. And why is that? Well, they put markets everywhere, roads everywhere, telephones everywhere. Millions of traders. I always characterize China's markets as 200 million farmers selling to 20 million traders. And the traders are just everywhere in a complete unregulated market. Not only unregulated, Beijing spent a lot of time making sure that this province wouldn't keep the produce from this province from going in. This was like an interstate commerce act that the United States put up to try to integrate the country. I remember listening to a story from India where these guys from the business school loaded up a truck in West Bengal with tomatoes, and they drove it to Mumbai. And if you drove all day and all night, it would take about 2.5 days, maybe 3 days to do that. It took them 2 weeks to do this because they kept getting stopped and pulled over and fined, and they had to bargain, and they would get their truck checked, and their light would be broken, and they'd have to switch their light, all just in the name of. And by the time they got to Mumbai, it was ketchup, right? And so this is a very and India says, well, these markets are going to exploit the poor. I think here what we're seeing is the markets are actually very pro-poor. China also integrated the borders. They brought tariffs down. This graph shows the difference of milk, dairy products, wheat, soybeans from zero, the world market price. So they were in the 80s, they were protecting some commodities and they were taxing other commodities, right? Rice and pork and vegetables. By 2002, 2005, right after WTO, China's prices were almost world market prices, that they wanted their farmers to compete against world market. And they did very well. You can see here, here's rice prices over the last 5 years, and you can see that Chinese rice prices are exactly the same as world market until this little spike here. The same thing, I'll tell you about that in a second. Wheat does the same thing. Maize, they're a big importer of maize. They're almost exactly at world market price plus the value-added tax. And so what we see is on the import side, they're quite liberalized. China actually blocks exports of these crops when world market prices go up. So world market prices go up, they have lots of rice. Indonesia doesn't have enough rice. They place orders on the Chinese to bring rice out to Indonesia, and the Chinese government says, no, we're going to protect our own consumers. And so on the export side, it's actually WTO legal, but it's very, very harmful to world markets. So that's its record on trade liberalization. Final policy, I think, is investment. So where do they put their investment dollars? Well, you know, Mao, you can see the 50s. The one thing Mao did was invest in irrigation. He put in lots and lots of irrigation, and China's benefited from that. But since the 1980s on, that investment has continued. Nearly 50% of cultivated area. In the United States, about 10% of our area is irrigated. In China, 50% is irrigated. And this big surface systems are all over, pervasive. The state did that, okay? I mean, they put the surface water in construction. Now, what they also did was they took their hands off the other part of water, which is groundwater, and they left it virtually unregulated. They don't charge any fees, they don't charge any water fees or pumping fees, and there's absolutely no subsidy for electricity. So there's no, it's a completely deregulated. They say, go out and pump. And of course, they're trying to stimulate farmer interest into investing in their own wells so they can increase productivity. In the 1960s and 70s, virtually the share of all, remember 50% of China's area is irrigated. Almost none of that was irrigated by groundwater in the 60s and 70s, almost zero. By 2002, half of North China was irrigated by wells. All of them drilled by small farmers. And then small farmers, they only had one moo, right, per person. They would then sell their water to their neighbors. So they would drill a well, they would then irrigate their own fields and then sell their water to their neighbors. And this is a big part of the story. The last part, I think, is maybe the most important lesson, which is investment into agriculture R&D. In fact, all the irrigation investment done, China has more roads and more high-speed rails than the United States. Now, not quite as many roads, but almost as the markets are liberalized, institutions are liberalized. So what can they do to maintain agriculture productivity? That's invest in new technologies. And most all of this is going to be public sector. They didn't do private sector. That's something they haven't done, and I think that it's probably it's a shortcoming in policy. But the state committed themselves. You remember this graph? Remember the left-hand side is once they gave incentives, total factor productivity rose, right? So the same people, they got 50% more output. Well, since that time, you can see productivity continues upward at about 2% a year. Okay, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%. Over the next, that was through 95. From 95 to 2005, it's been 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. So China continues every year to squeeze 3% more out of its agriculture sector than it was the previous year with the same amount of inputs, same amount of land, same amount of people. Actually, that's not true. If you look at the top graph, so those labels there are early indica, late indica, different types of rice, wheat, maize, soybean, cotton. If you look at the top one, that says how much of that rise of productivity came from input reduction versus output rise, right? As wages go up, people were moving off the off-farm sector and output was staying the same. So they were getting the same amount of output, but fewer people are doing it. That's productivity increases, and that's been going through. So is 2 or 3% a year good? The United States has grown its agriculture sector at 2% a year for the last 100 years, all of it with total factor productivity growth, almost. We have about the same amount of land. There's fewer people, but we have more machines. And so a country that can, for 20, 30 years, get 2 to 3% a year of productivity is good. So, and it also happened for fruits and vegetables at the same time. So all the crops have seen those productivity rises. So what caused this? Well, it's basically one thing: government commitment to investment in R&D. And China's been relentless in investing. Invest, and especially as fiscal revenue started to go up, they started to increase the share. By 2005, they got the 0.7. This year, they're going to hit 1% of agriculture GDP is going to be invested into R&D. That's what the United States is. We're 1% of R&D. Australia is 2%. Which is extremely, extremely high. So there's been more rise of research. Actually, the U.S. has been falling over time. Since 2000, the size of research investment in China has been higher than any other country in the world. Somebody told me that before the world food prices went up from 2000 to 2007, the increase of investment in R&D, agriculture R&D in China, was more than the whole world added up together, because a lot of developing countries were falling at that time. So that they've really taken that to heart. Now, they also thought they were going to put their eggs in the agriculture biotech research basket. By 2003, they were investing about $1 billion a year in biotech. By 2010, by 2011, I just got this figure. They're investing $2 billion a year. They're out investing the U.S. in biotech, so they invest more. Now, the United States, we have about $1.5 billion from the public sector, and then we have the private sector that puts in about $1.5 billion. So the U.S. is still out investing China in biotech, but the public sector is China's government spending more than ours. There's no private sector. Now, there's only been one success story so far. There's lots of products that are on the shelf ready to go. China's having the same debate the rest of the world is. Do we need biotech or not? But in the case of cotton, it was incredibly successful. Their cotton crop was a variety of BT cotton. The bollworm infested China's fields in the early 90s. They were almost ready to give up producing cotton. You produce BT cotton, the cotton expresses a poison and kills the bollworm before it can get into the cotton boll. It's released in 1996. By 2003, there's 5 million farmers that are using BT cotton. There's only 1 million farmers in the U.S., so there's 5 times more farmers that are using BT cotton in the whole U.S. We did these studies in all of these different areas, and we wanted to see, were farmers benefiting from this? And what we saw was there's basically no difference in how they put on fertilizer or irrigation or machinery or harvest, but pesticide use, labor use, and seed prices change. Here is the non-BT variety, and these farmers were spraying 20 times a year to try to kill those bollworms. The bollworms are basically resistant. The farmers who were planting BT were only spraying 5 times a year or 6 times a year. And so huge reduction in pesticide use. Yields went up. Okay, so down went inputs, up went yields, and of course that means a huge gain of productivity, about 30%. So just releasing a biotech variety increased productivity a lot. I mean, I think that there's big policy decisions to be made elsewhere in the world on this. There's even more benefits than this productivity gains. So here are these farmers trying to suppress the bollworm or the plant hopper there's on rice. They're out there. This is how farmers in developing countries put on pesticide. They walk up the road this way. It's perfectly fine to walk up the road this way because the wind's blowing this way. But as they're blowing back, they're going like this, and the pesticide covers them, okay, as they go back. So what we went and did is we went and looked at the farmers who were planting only BT and the plantings who were planting only non-BT, and we asked them, we call them poisonings, but we asked them, were you ever so sick after spraying that you had to miss an entire day of work laying in bed because you were so uncomfortable? And 30% of the farmers who had been spraying on the non-BT reported that they had been poisoned or that they had been so sick they couldn't work. Zero. None of the farmers who were planting BT cotton reported that. So it's quite an amazing success story. China now has on the shelf BT corn, BT maize, rice, a number of different Roundup-ready soybeans, and a couple other GM crops, but they won't release them because they're worried about consumer impacts. China has some hard decisions to make. I think the rest of the world has to make them too. So summary of China's ag development and its status. In a word, it's success, right? They took land and gave it to all farmers. Every single household has land. There's not one household that doesn't have land, which gave an incentive to every one farmer. They gave them a little piece of land, but they had an incentive to use it. They fostered markets. They didn't regulate markets. They deregulated them. They didn't distort. They invested in roads and communications. And then they invested heavily in water and heavily in agriculture and R&D. And some of these investments were coming at a time when China has some more fiscal resources. You know, they could retire our debt like tomorrow. They have so many fiscal resources, yeah. But back in the 80s and 90s, these were very scarce terms. And the leaders were willing to say, we're going to give up a little of this to get the agriculture sector going. So what didn't China do? Okay, so what didn't China do? I always call it the P word, privatization. So these 200 million farmers out here have use rights to the land, but that land's not theirs. They can't sell it. They can't collateralize it. They can do long-term rental, but nobody really believes in long-term rentals. They think if I rent it out to somebody for 10 years, 5 years from now, somebody's going to think it's their land and not mine, right? I don't have a title to it. You know, it's really been an ideology problem, and it's a fear of loss of control. And I think there's two lessons to that. There's positive and negative effects to giving farmers use rights and not giving them actually ownership rights. There's certainly less incentive to invest. It's less incentive to build large farms, or it's harder to build large farms. Chinese farms are still extremely small. And there's really no asset base to build wealth on. China has had the highest, most rapidly rising inequality in the world in the last 20 years. In the last 10 years, it's continued to rise. Even the wages have risen, right? You see wages have rise, you think, well, wait a minute, inequality should be falling. The problem is that rural people have no assets. Urban people were given their houses. So they used to be state-owned house, then the state gave it to them, and since 2000s, the price of housing has gone up, you know, to Bay Area levels, okay? And so suddenly the city people have become rich with assets. The people from the countryside don't have any assets. And so that's what's driven this inequality. So this is the bad part of that. On the other hand, the state uses the land for investment with much reason. That's the loss of control. I was told a story about England, who's just made a decision to put in 500 kilometers of high-speed rail in England to improve transportation. They're going to finish 500 kilometers of high-speed rail in 2033. Okay. Now, well, California, we aren't going to finish ours at all, right? China decided to build a 2,000 kilometer link between Beijing, Shanghai, on the Hangzhou, through the Yolo or Yangtze River Delta. From the time they made the decision to the time the first train went was 39 months, and they were done. So, and that's because they went in and bought the land. The farmers had to sell them the land, right? They paid them off a little, and so it's, I mean, it's that you can see that there is, and the top leaders will tell you they're going to sacrifice for mother country, right? And yeah, it's the hard fact of life. You can see certainly positive and negative. Next one, no subsidies of inputs. Fertilizer has always been sold at world market prices. Pesticides always been sold at world market prices. There's high incentives to suppliers because prices are high, right? And so no Chinese can't buy fertilizer. The day before or the few days before the crop goes in, every village has these little peddlers with these big microphones saying, you know, I have 2010-4, compound fertilizer for sale from a German company. It may not be from a German company, but that's what they say. And you know, I have nitrogen fertilizer, and the farmers come out and they buy their fertilizer. It's a market price, but these suppliers have an incredible incentive to go sell at these market prices. No water subsidies. We talked about that. Now, general subsidies have risen. In 2011, the average farmer in Illinois made $50 an acre in subsidies. Now remember, prices are really high because of biofuels and other things. So there's no price component to that because the markets. The average farmer in Sichuan, the average farmer anywhere in China, is making $80 an acre. It's almost European rates of subsidies. Now, you know, look at the rise of subsidies. They've learned the subsidy game. But the good news is that these subsidies today are uncoupled, they're decoupled, that they're just transfers. They're really just income transfers to the people of the land, which is every rural farmer. 98% of Chinese farmers get these subsidies. And it doesn't, remember, 70% of them are working in the city. So even if you're working in the city, the state is giving you money for agriculture. It's actually a decoupled subsidy. So far, it's basically been so good, so in terms of distortions there. Organization of production. China has not used co-ops, okay? The government really is afraid of co-ops. The Taiwan co-op movement brought down the monopoly of the Kuomintang, of the KMT. They were really the source of opposition party in Taiwan. You don't think China learned that lesson? They don't want a national co-op movement out there. As a result, only 8% of villages have co-ops, only 2% of farmers belong to co-ops. This makes it very different than Japan, South Korea, the early US in the 1990s, where everyone belonged to co-op, and co-op helped with marketing, co-op helped with delivery of inputs and technology. And so China is very, very different than that. I think it leaves households vulnerable in some sense. But, you know, markets have taken its place, right? I mean, they've deregulated the markets, and the markets do maybe everything those co-ops did in these other places. So the status of the economy, stepping back, is China really solved its macro food nutrient problem. Until 2008, China was exporting more food and then it was importing. Today even, China is a net importer of agriculture commodities, but if you take cotton away, cotton comes in as agriculture, gets sent out as industrial, as shirts and everything. If you take that away, China is still self-sufficient in food. Absolute poverty rates have fallen from 40% in 1980 to 5% today, and you've seen this huge structural transformation. And it's more than this. I mean, this looks like, 350 million people. Well, that still leaves 150, lots of the Chinese think like this. Well, there's still 150 million people in the rural areas. I always say, well, let's look at who's left there. In 1990, if you take all these rural, everybody between 16 and 50, in 1990, about a quarter to a third of them were moving off the farm. 75% of them were working on the farm, okay? Look at those 16 to 20-year-olds, 16 to 25-year-olds. By 2011, 3/4 of them were working off the farm, right? So that by 20 years later, they're almost all working on the farm. But look at the 16 to 20-year-olds today, the new guys who come in, everyone's working off the farm. I taught in the Stanford Overseas Studies program. We had 30 Stanford students come in, and Helen Bing then gives us some money to go take a trip. Scott takes us to great places, but there's always one day that I take them to the rural areas. And we went up to northern Shanxi once, and they all ate in a cave with a farmer. If they spoke Mandarin or not. It was an incredible experience. But I told them when they went out, I said, here guys, here's a wallet full of 100 yuan bills. 100 yuan is $15. For an undergrad, $15 is a lot, right? I said, anyone who you are out there that finds a male between the ages of 16 and 40, one of these 100 yuan is yours. Take your picture, get their ID, take a picture of their ID, and bring it to me, you get 100 yuan. I've done this now for at least 10 trips, Stanford students and others. I've never given away a 100 yuan bill. Because there's no young kids left. They're all gone. Okay? And this transformation has really, really happened. So, investment in agriculture has also played a key role in this transformation, creating a virtuous. Remember, what does agriculture supposed to do? Build housing, invest in education as incomes rise, finance the move off the farm into the city to get a job, start self-employed enterprises, and it was a source of demand. In the early stages of industrialization, the early factories were these rural township and village enterprises. In turn, now that all this off-farm income is coming back to agriculture and generating a robust agriculture system, there's very high rates of fertilizer use in the world, no credit. Nobody borrows money for fertilizer. That's because their kid is sending it back to them. Or if they don't have a kid out there, they borrow it from their cousin for 0 interest rate, buy the fertilizer and pay him back at the end of the year. Of course, you owe him the next credit. So it's not real zero. But investments by households in the groundwater, investments by households in fruit and vegetable production. So it's been this sort of virtuous cycle. Higher earnings from agriculture allow additional push off the farm. So China's agriculture is not perfect. I mean, I could spend as much time on this side, but it's really sort of rich country problems. There's a huge demand for meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables. There's serious, when you have 200 million farmers selling to 20 million traders, there's no traceability. We did a survey of consumers. 98% of Beijing consumers think their food is tainted. I mean, that they just don't believe anything. My wife, when we go to China, takes a suitcase this big full of cereal, and she eats cereal for breakfast and cereal for lunch. I just go eat. Supply side constraints. Land is too small. Privatization. Water. Hey, you don't charge for water. People pump it, and they're pumping like crazy. There's water problems. Small, aging farmers. There's only 2 types of farmers in China: old men and middle-aged women who are taking care of grandkids. They strap their grandkids to their back and they go out and they farm. That's who's farming out there. Rising wages, which are really stressing agriculture. Rising net imports. China is going to be a net importer in the long run. So that gives serious national food security. So there's lots and lots of things that China still has to work on. It's by far away not a perfect system. So last couple minutes, what are the lessons for Africa? There's 4 more slides. Incentives are important. I mean, I think that this is very key. Now, I think this lesson is being learned. Certainly, Alain and Derek Byerly and the World Bank in their, spent a lot of time on this, and there's actually showed that there's been a lot of movement towards privatization or private holdings or better rights to land, but there's in a lot of places there still aren't. So providing those incentives are, and it's just the incentives to make decisions, the incentive to produce is enough, at least in the short run. They don't need pure ownership, and I think that. Of course, the farmers have to believe that if I plant that crop or plant that tree, that I'm going to get the output. So it's not that easy, but incentives, the rights to the income and the rights to the crop choice is very important, but probably enough. Secure rights would be better. Remember, China's government does all the investment into surface agriculture, all the investment into roads, all the investment into land leveling. That's because the farmers don't want to do it, because they don't have that land forever. So the state has to take on a bigger role. So I think that the lack of this all can lead to equity problems. 2, markets can be an effective tool of development. Markets can be pro-poor. Markets have integrated China's food economy, and this has increased efficiency, it's increased specialization, it's increased the income of the poor. I think this is probably the least understood lesson from China. That they basically, and this is an easy one for governments to do, just get your hands off of there. It's really not that easy. I mean, it's hands off of some things. They got out of the way of trading, they let the private sector emerge, they actually enforced interstate commerce acts, and they didn't provide subsidies that reduced incentives for traders to do that. So I think that's right. And on the other hand, though, they took their hands and put it into building roads and communications and enforcing these interprovincial marketing clauses. So I think that there's real hard lessons that can be applied, and this can be applied in governments that don't have a lot of resources, right? That's why China did it in their, give the land to the farmers, that didn't cost us anything. Open up markets, that didn't cost us anything. So this is when a government is strapped, these are things to do. Greatest role for the state is investment in the public goods. Roads, water, afforestation, agriculture technologies, agricultural extension. We could talk a lot. China's made a lot of problems with extension. The extension system distorts more decisions than markets do up till recently, and that's changing as they're finally fixing it. Households took responsibility for investing into groundwater, orchards, machinery, input supply. Let the farmers do the production, we'll do the infrastructure. And that's been a remarkable, sort of partnership, I think. And at first, it was, when investment dollars were scarce, it was hard. Last one. Getting incentives right to government. I actually haven't spent any time on this, and I put it up afterwards. And then I thought, I don't have it's a very complicated story. It's how do you keep the government from being a corrupt sort of actor who's going to suppress reform and suppress growth and try to siphon off funds, and stop development to become a participant in it, a co-benefit. And China did a number of things that made it co-beneficial. Remember, they stopped the parastatals, right? They shut down the parastatals. Well, they did, and you'd think, well, the parastatal guys wouldn't want to let the traders come. They made the parastatal bureaucrats into traders. They said, that building you're using and those we're going to give them to you, and you're going to be a trader. Okay? Now, we're going to let that guy trade here, and you can go trade there, so they're going to compete against each other. But they made the bureaucrats who might have stopped. And then suddenly there's no fertilizer subsidies, there's no grain subsidies, so there's nothing to go steal, right? There's no wedge between market and so these sorts of policies, China's system of and then it had another thing. I mean, they went back to, and this probably isn't very policy relevant for many parts of the world, they went back to 5,000 years of history when China thought up the meritocracy system. We're going to promote the smartest guys in our system, and that's how they promote people. I mean, you saw the new leadership, right? The premier has a PhD, the vice premier has a PhD, 3 other vice premiers have master's degrees, right? You promote smart people, and I don't know how that gets translated. But other lessons, this is a legacy of a one-party system, right? Ambitious leaders at the top have the goal of China becoming a world power. Again, I don't know how we take that further. What countries learn about what not to do. China set up these, we could talk a lot about this, set up these artificial barriers between rural and urban that still exist today. Everybody has a stamp on their ear. I'm a rural person or an urban person. It's not true. They have an ID card that says they're a rural or urban person, and there's one set of rights for city people and one set of rights for rural people, and it's caused the highest inequality in the world. As China moves forward, I think this is a real problem, and they can't get rid of it. I mean, that it's policy-wise and fiscal-wise, it's a legacy they're going to have to deal with. China invested a lot into rural nutrition and health, but far from enough, right? China got basic education right. They taught rural kids to read and write and to be disciplined. That's all they taught them to do, and they made great factory workers. Well, the factories are leaving. Now those factory workers have to become service sector workers and have to know math, science, English, good Chinese, and they don't know how because they underinvested. While at the same time that South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan were sending all kids to high school, only about 40% of Chinese poor rural areas, the kids were going to high school. And so they got massive, they had 200 million people that can barely read or write, and wages are going to be at $8 an hour in 20 years. Who's going to hire someone that can't read or write when the wage is, they have to pay them $50,000 a year? They're going to become unemployable. What's going to happen to them? So there's a lot. Don't do that there. I'm going to stop right there and get the real word. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is really an excellent question. What can Africa learn from China? I think we have all been impressed by what has been happening with China. There is no better scholars than Jin-Kun and Scott to tell us about what has been happening. They have not only followed the Chinese progress and transformation overall and in agriculture for the last 30 years, but they have done some of the best empirical work. And some of their work has, as a consequence, been very well received in the profession, and we have all learned from them. So what I want to do first is start from a different starting point that Scott has been using, in the sense that there has been very rapid growth in Africa in the last decade, and we should be starting with this. Then I want to look at, well, what kind of growth has there been, what strength and what fragilities does it have. Look at the lessons that Jin-Kun and Scott have given us in terms of China and China applying to Africa, and I think we have to agree with them. However, Africa is not China. There are very important differences. So what else can we extract from the Chinese experience that could apply to China? So here on the right-hand side, I start with the fact that there were indeed dark years, but the dark years are already kind of 13 years behind us. And what has been happening in the last 13 years is a different story. And we have to start from this and not from the perception that there has been no growth, there has been no income gain, there has been no poverty reduction. This is not the case, right? So what we see is that indeed there were sort of the more than 20 years, starting in 1975, going through the debt crisis, going through structural adjustment, going through the Washington Consensus, but ending up in 2000, where suddenly things started to happen and growth picked up. The rate of growth was quite in excess of population growth. So what we have, as you can see on the right-hand side, the last phase of GDP per capita growth, a per capita growth which is about 2% per year, which is in excess of where GDP growth is in excess of population growth. Right? And what we see is that when we look at China, which is the third country on the left, and India, we have about 10 sub-Saharan African countries that are there in the fast-growing countries with performances which are not dissimilar to what we see in China and in India. So the issue is not so much growth, but the issue is what kind of growth, how can growth be made more accessible to more countries and not to just a subset of the countries that have been growing rapidly. And then how can this growth be used for poverty reduction more effectively than it has been in the past. So let's look at African growth, and what we see is kind of strengths and fragilities. And let's start by looking at the source of growth. And there are two implications that Scott did not discuss, which seems to me are really important when we look at China, which is governance, and especially democracy versus autocracy. And the other is kind of neo-mercantilism. How much of a pattern of growth which is driven by exports as opposed by domestic market is something which is applicable to Africa and which should be emulated by African growth, including because of the temptations that the continent is actually rich in natural resources, in land, in petroleum, in mineral products, and hence there is the potential for kind of an export-driven growth performance out of this. What we see here is, if you look at the South Asia and East Asia, that industry and services have been the main engines of growth, but that exports has been a very important source of effective demand creation. And indeed what we call neo-mercantilism, namely a highly depreciated real exchange rate, the accumulation of foreign exchange reserves in US Treasury bonds and in Europe, and as a consequence, avoidance of appreciation of the real exchange rate, cheap exports, expensive imports, domestic consumers being penalized, and as a consequence, what we see is that wages are actually not a source of effective demand. Wages are a cost on growth. When if we look at the growth of Africa, we see something which is quite different, right? That the growth in the last 10 years has not been based on fundamentally export. It has been largely based on domestic market. And agriculture has been a very important sector in terms of overall economic growth. So what can be said about sub-Saharan growth since 2000, which is our starting point to look at the Chinese experience? First, that the growth fundamentals tend to be in place. The rate of inflation is relatively low. The government deficit is what it should be, less than 2% of GDP. The public debt is quite low compared, say, to the United States or Europe, where you have. Second, we see the continuation of civil conflicts. There are armed conflicts, as we know, in Mali, in northern Nigeria, in Somalia, and Sudan, in many places. The election results are frequently contested. So growth fundamentals are in place. We basically have a market-driven investment with a rapid rate of growth in foreign direct investment, a declining dependence on foreign aid, and the emergence of financial platforms, as we have seen in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. There is a reorientation of trade. China is the main trading partner for Africa today. It is no longer the former colonial powers, which are the destination of exports. There has been an important structural transformation with rapid urbanization, with 36% of the population in the urban sector. There is a demographic transition which is creating a one-time opportunity of having a relatively low dependency ratio with relatively few elderly people, less younger people relative to the share of the labor force, which is a working age, which has been in Asia an important contributor to high rates of savings and high rates of labor force participation. Africa is getting into that similar period. It's a very important opportunity in terms of growth. Right? Social progress, extreme poverty has indeed declined 42% to 34%. And what we see quite importantly, and that's the argument I'm going to be making in relation to this sort of neo-mercantilist alternative, the emergence of a middle class, the development of a domestic market, which is based on the fact that people move out of extreme poverty and enter into a situation where the levels of per capita income are such that it creates effective demand for the products of industry, for higher qualities of diets coming out of agriculture. And then finally, some progress in governance. Namely, we see that now 60% or so of the regimes in the African countries have elections and are proceeding along a democratic path. Growth remains fragile. We have to be careful not to idealize what we see. There are still large disparities. Some countries have $8,000 of per capita income, others have 400. So we see a 1 to 20 income gap across countries. Civil conflicts, as I mentioned, weakness in governance and endemic corruption. This is, of course, one of the biggest differences between the sub-Saharan African and Chinese situation, the quality of the public service, the strength of leadership, and hence the role of governance in terms of policy coordination and public investment. Population pressure, it's a very large number of young people entering into the labor force, high rates of unemployment among the youth, displacement to the cities, which is often population accumulating in the urban slums as opposed to finding productive investment. And then finally, extensive poverty in the sense that poverty rates have fallen, but the mass of the poor has remained relatively constant. And we know of the health drama, HIV, AIDS, and the falling life expectancy that is around 45 years old in a number of countries, including in South Africa, where life expectancy has been declining as a consequence of endemics. So lessons from China, basically what Scott told us at the end is incentives, which is property rights and investment climate, the role of the market, integrated, high sort of coordination in price movements as a consequence of effective hedging, facilitated in part by communications and by roads, the role of the state in terms of public goods, which are complement to what private investments can do once those public goods are in place. And finally, and importantly, and this is indeed something that needs to be further explored, is how do you create incentives for public officials, including incentives which are going to take them away from corrupt practices and perform as better civil servants. And then the don't-do list of what, which is the restriction of rural urban labor mobility, the system that Scott described. And what we see is that the transformation in China has been one where, because of labor was constrained from moving to the urban areas, industry moved towards where labor is at an important rate of decentralization. And the fact that, as Scott could observe, an important share of the rural population being engaged in rural non-farm activities is supported by decentralization, which in part is sort of the reverse of the medal of restrictions on labor movements, where industry went to where labor is and hence created those complementary sources of income for the rural population. And second, the lack of investment in health and education beyond basics, which is particularly important when you have rural transformation and the displacement of population from one sector of activity to another one. So if I reinterpret the message that Scott is giving us, basically two fundamental lessons to be extracted from China for Africa. One is the fundamental role of agriculture at the stage of development at which sub-Saharan Africa finds itself today. Productivity growth in smallholder agriculture at that stage of growth, driven by market-based incentives and public support. And second, the role of governance, strong leadership, capable public administration from central to local, through training, but also through the incentives which are given to these public officials. So let me move towards extracting more, in a sense, and saying, well, Africa is not China, so there are lessons that don't apply, and there are maybe other lessons that do apply beyond the ones that have been mentioned. Right? So there are actually two similarities between China and Africa at the particular stage of growth at which the African countries find themselves. Is on the one hand, a large smallholder population, and hence the need to bank on the entrepreneurial capacity and the investment capacity of this smallholder population to have a dynamic agricultural sector, a dynamic agro-industrial sector, and sort of a path towards industrialization that goes from industry, from agriculture to agro-industry, and to more sophisticated forms of industrialization. And second, the potential for a kind of neo-mercantilist model, as I was describing before, namely export-led, where the wage is a cost on growth but not a benefit, is not a source of effective demand, and the rise in wage, in a sense, is going to contradict the dynamics of this neo-mercantilist model. And the way you're going to have to move out of this model is by raising wages, right? Which we see happening in China, but maybe not fast enough, in a sense, to replace the dynamics of the external market. And as a consequence, we see a tension here, that is the move from a neo-mercantilist to a domestic market-led path of growth is not something which happens very easily. And we see here kind of lags in fact, rising wages and rising domestic markets, which are kind of in conflict with the maintenance of the neo-mercantilist model. Africa's weaknesses relative to China: first, many of those countries are landlocked, many of those countries are ill-designed, were sort of drawn on maps without verification as to kind of tribal differences. A key issue in terms of agriculture is that there's very little water control in Africa. There's only about 7% of the land which is irrigated. It's mainly rain-fed farming. Now, rain-fed farming means something very important, is that we have highly heterogeneous situations. There are no economies of scale. Many agroecologies, each agroecology has a different requirement in terms of technology, in terms of inputs. Quite often, because of the fragmentation of institutions, those agroecologies also correspond to different institutional setups, different forms of governance, and hence a major challenge, and this is where there's a big discrepancy with the Chinese and the Indian situation as well, is that we have to be able to manage heterogeneity. We have to be able to find a system whereby localized production systems can be adapted to local conditions, as opposed to the situations where we can have over very large areas kind of homogeneous production systems supported by similar institutions. Then Africa is a late comer in the sense that it has to deal with globalization and global competition. It has to deal with integrated value chains. Supermarkets are emerging all over Africa. Food chains are different. Small farmers supplying, as Peter Timmer has very importantly explored, supplying supermarkets is a huge challenge in terms of standardization, sanitary and phytosanitary requirements that supermarkets are going to have, and how do you organize a smallholder sector to be able to deliver to this type of marketing system. And then finally, climate change that we cannot deny. Maybe it's not happening very visibly in the short run, but if we project to 2050, we know that climate change is going to be a very big issue, especially for tropical Africa, and hence agricultural development in Africa has to deal with the issue of resilience to climate change, which was not the case in a sense when we look at what has been happening with agriculture in the Chinese and the Indian situation. The advantages over China, which should not be overlooked, is one, a dynamic population. China has a rapidly aging population with youth, with still low population density in a sense. So in spite of the fact that there's kind of a crowding of labor markets because of the rapid entry of youth onto those markets and the difficulty of finding jobs to offer to them, the labor could be a tremendous advantage that Africa has to offer, provided it had the right labor policy and the right labor cost and the right labor training to be attractive to foreign direct investment. When Justin Lin came to Berkeley and to Davis recently, his argument was, well, wages are rising in China, those industries have to go elsewhere. Where are they going to be going? Africa is the main destination. Mauritius certainly has been. Much of Africa has not been, right? Policies may be not attractive for foreign direct investment to leave China, where it found cheap and well-trained and relatively docile labor, and find similar conditions in the African context. But the population is there. The potential in terms of labor force is there. Land and water abundance, there has been kind of the big move towards land grabbing, towards capturing. Some estimates are that only about 30 to 40% of potential cultivable land in Africa is actually effectively used. Now, at the same time, there are no idle lands. There are people everywhere, and this is the issue then of lack of property rights, displacement of traditional populations where you get into those land deals, and the difficulty without formal property rights of investing foreign direct investment to open up some of those new lands. At the same time, the potential is there, and there are lessons to be learned. And one interesting case is the Brazilian example. Namely, Brazil has been sort of walking on two legs in terms of farm population. A large smallholder population, small farmers supported by specific extension programs, particular lines of credit for them, an Embrapa effort to deliver smallholder farmer type production systems, and at the same time a large farm sector, the Cerrado, with important technological change, agro-exports, infrastructure investment, very large farms consolidated. And Brazil has been quite effective at managing this duality. In part, it's sort of a peaceful coexistence with two separate ministries of agriculture, one dedicated to smallholder farming and one dedicated to large farms. But there are also many situations where you see complementarities between the two. Small and large belong to the same corps. Small and large can have a division of labor with subcontracting of large farms passing down to small farms, particular tasks, for example, in breeding, which then are incorporated by the large farms. So let me restate what are the policy implications of the main two implications that Scott presented to us, right? One is agriculture as smallholder farmers, right? But what we need, in a sense, is a comprehensive strategy for those smallholder farmers. China had it, in a sense, with the household responsibility system didn't just fall from the sky. It was a rationalized perspective on what to do with this smallholder population, how to improve the productivity of farming in those conditions, how to also create complementary sources of income for this farm population to be able to emerge out of poverty without necessarily massive displacement towards the urban sector. Africa has CAADP. CAADP is under NEPAD. CAADP is sort of a coordination and a source of counsel for the agriculture sector, and especially this recommendation that countries should invest no less than 10% of their public resources into agriculture. Yet there is no vision for smallholders. Where are smallholders going to go? Are they in transition? Are they going to stay? Are they going to go? How are they going to relate to the large farm sector, which is emerging in the context of those foreign direct investments? What kind of complementarities are we going to build between the two? There's a sort of lack of a vision as to how do we see the smallholder sector fitting a la Brazil, in a sense, into a perspective on where to go with agriculture and where to go with rural development. So that's what we learned from China, but translated into policy, what it means that we have to go beyond CAADP and we have to have a vision for rural development. And second, we need to address the problem of governance in support of agriculture. That, of course, is easier said than done. And so let me propose here to finish 4 recommendations. The first one is, yes, we need to improve governance, and there have been important programs in terms of democracy. There's sort of the temptation that China offers of autocracy instead of democracy, and I think this is something we need to go back to and discuss. To me, there are 2 main lessons from China that one has to be careful of when we extrapolate what they may mean for Africa. Right? The first one is the issue of what kind of political regime, and the temptations of autocracy and kind of strong governance, government-led patterns of growth is there. And yet, at the same time, what we see is that democracy has something to offer, democratic progress has been made, and hence the issue of governance and democracy is to be preserved. So with weakness of governance, we can indeed have programs to improve governance, but there are kind of 2 alternatives that one can bank on at the same time as we do this, which on the one hand, the private sector. Now, what I learned from Scott in his presentation was this tremendous importance of the merchants, of the traders, which are in essence linking farming to the urban sector probably both ways. That is, they are not only taking the goods to the consumers, but they're also taking inputs and new seeds and adapted production system to the farm sector. Here, I think what has been well done by the Gates Foundation and by the Rockefeller Foundation, this idea of agro-dealers. That is, you cannot ask government to do what it is not able to do, both because of lack of resources and because of lack of capacity. But you can build a private sector which is going to assume those particular functions. Given what we have seen of the rain-fed farming nature of African agriculture, the tremendous heterogeneity of agroecologies, what you need is agro-dealers that are going to be able to manage this diversity of situations and bring the right seeds and the right fertilizer and chemical packages to each of those particular niches in terms of agroecological features. And there is an important alternative here to thinking governance. We can think private sector and make an effort to develop that sector. The second is the importance of organized civil society. No co-ops in China. One can see why, right? China came from a cooperative system, the collective system in a sense, and there's this very strong resistance to go back to a situation which is seen more as a retrogression than a way forward. Right? At the same time, all over the world, we know that smallholder farmers cannot do it alone. They need organizations. They need to achieve economies of scale. They need to develop market power, and this is done via the organization. A huge tension in Africa is between sort of the modern farm organization, producer organization, and the traditional customary forms of authority. One of the big dilemmas in terms of land grabs is that property rights are in fact held through the customary powers. And as a consequence, when a foreign direct investor comes and negotiates access to land, it is with those customary authorities, which are not representative, which are not elected, which are not consultative, which tend to be sort of the elders of the community that are assuming this role. Manage the complementarities between small and large farm, the Brazilian example. We cannot deny the fact you go to Mozambique, you go to Angola, large tracts of land which are very much underused. Could go into large-scale farming, but then we need to explicitly manage the rules of the game for the large farm sector and how large and small are going to either coexist or are going to be built in complementarity. Need prepare all population for a successful structural transformation. That's exactly the lesson from China that Scott mentioned to us at the end. There has been a lot of movement out of the rural areas in Africa, but it tends to be towards the slums. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because those populations are not prepared to perform in urban labor markets. And then finally, I think to resist the temptation of neo-mercantilism, what we see is the tremendous importance, and China is a major actor in linking Africa to the world market for mineral resources, for food products that can be exported. The temptation of neo-mercantilism, I think, are very big. Namely, keep wage as a cost, look at the external market, find effective demand for the products, call on foreign direct investment, import technology, and service the external market. Yes, it can work, but it's difficult to get out of it, in a sense, once it is put into place. And the alternative is one where we see, and this has been very much, I think, the theme in this series of conferences, a smallholder farmer sector moving up in the scale of incomes towards kind of a middle class, creating a domestic market. And this domestic market is the source of effective demand for the products of both agriculture and industry. So thank you very much. Thank you, Scott. This was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you, both Scott and Alain, for a great set of comments. And there are so many things. I just filled 2 notebooks of questions myself. I promised Prabhu I would give him the first question, so I will turn it over to him first and then open it up to everyone for questions. Prabhu?
Thank you, Roz. Scott, Alain, that was just a wonderful set of presentations. Certainly a very useful complement to the great lectures that have been part of this series, and I'm sure one that a lot of people will refer to into the future. I have 1 comment and 2 questions. My comment is on the lost decades. Scott, when you talk about the lost decades and the fact that the household responsibility system came in and that boosted overall productivity growth in China, that's right, but I think you undervalue the fact that in those lost decades, China continued to have massive investments in R&D and continued to have massive investments in infrastructure investments. And without those investments taking place, the household responsibility system in itself would not have been as successful. And so as you think about the lessons for Africa, I think it's important to stress that those investments in R&D and those investments in infrastructure take a long, long time, and that Africa needs to be patient in making those long-term commitments to those investments, even as the incentive systems are improved. And that's something that one could think about emphasizing in a future version of this talk. On the issue of biotechnology, China has made huge investments, but it's kind of disappointing that China has not been able to release a GM food crop. And it looks like China is stalled in the process of moving forward in a GM crop release. And in not being able to do so, China is not able to provide leadership to the rest of the developing community in terms of biotechnology. And I wonder whether there's a way in which we can break this current logjam and see a future in which China can be more proactive on the GM crop issues. The last comment I want to make is, so China has been doing some work in African agriculture development now. You see Chinese agriculture scientists and extension people, et cetera, in different countries in Africa. I wonder if you can give us a bit of a flavor on how that experience has been going and what's the future of that experience. Thank you, Ross.
Thanks, Prabhu. So Scott, why don't you start with the GM question? And Elaine, obviously there's certain GM resistance in Africa as well. You might talk about where that is right now. Scott?
So do biotech and then do the second one? Okay, good. My colleague Jiquin, as you know, has been at the heart of the debate and research effort at understanding the role of biotech in China's agriculture, and we did all the initial work on BT cotton, and it was so successful with raising productivity for the poor, for the entire gamut of all the cotton farmers. And then we did more experiments as the new varieties were in trial phases, and they basically had the same impact for rice farmers. For a couple different types of genetically modified rice crops. And it was thought that those would work their way through the system and be released. And as you know, as that process continued, there was basically a lot of, it has been, two things were happening. This was all through the early 2000s. Rice prices were really low, and there started to build consumer resistance to releasing it. And so the government basically said, well, if rice prices are so low, you know, do we really even need to release them, right? And maybe we'll save them and wait until prices go up, was sort of the thought. And then we need to expand production. But by the time 2008 comes and prices, you know, the world food crisis hits, the consumer resistance is so high that the leadership basically didn't act. So it's shelved. I don't see any real future for that outside of a food crisis that is going to come along until perhaps the commercialization of farming proceeds, which is going to be a slow, long thing. So I think it's stalled, especially on the food crops. Now, that given, I think that will China be a leader in this? It's possible. They have genetically modified BT corn, BT maize is ready to go, and their variety is almost as good as the early U.S. varieties, which were very successful in increasing productivity, and Roundup Ready soybeans. They've now done the work on Roundup Ready soybeans, so this is herbicide resistant soybeans, and they're ready to go. So, and these are two crops that aren't consumed in large degrees directly by consumers. They're processed, and with soybeans, the genetically modified. So I think that's what you have to look at: is are they going to go ahead with maize and soybeans? And and of course, these are the two crops that China is importing in large volumes, right? Half the world's soybeans are imported into China. China is now the second largest maize importer, and it's going to rise as demand for meat goes up. So I think that's where you're going to have to look at. For now, I think the direct food crops, so rice and wheat, they have some virus-resistant wheats that have basically never even got through trials. So, so it's a consumer versus producer problem, and I think that the consumers have won, and I think it's because such a small share of rural income comes from farming. Why do it, right? If consumers are going to get so angry, and then what happened if there was a health problem because of that? So I mean, that's sort of the psyche. So watch corn, watch soybeans, and I think that's what we'll see if China is going to take a lead in the developing world in that.
Alain.
I think the debate is not so much between producers and consumers as between the production side and the environmental issue. Because on the consumer side, the fact, I mean, we have all been consuming BT corn for the last 20 years, right? And it's quite, in a sense, an interesting natural experiment that there has not been any visible consequence on the consumer side. On the other hand, there's a lot of concern with the environmental impact that BT might have, that GMOs might have. Here, there's also a confusion on the GMO debate between the BT and the Roundup Ready. Right? The Roundup Ready is an invitation to an extensive use of herbicides and chemicals in agriculture. BT is the opposite. BT is a substitute, and as you showed in your slides, to a very important decline in the use of pesticides. So the debate is not so much with consumption, I think, as it is with the environment. Now, there are issues, for example, with Mexico. Mexico is a value of center for maize, but Africa is not. Maize in Africa was imported from Latin America. There is no wild maize that is growing in Africa. So the fact that there would be gene flows into the stock of maize does not apply to the case of Africa. So the debate is, as we know, ill-posed. It comes in large part because of European pressure, in large part because of European NGOs that are very opposed to the spread of GMOs in Africa. And unfortunately, it has become a hurdle to technological progress. And I think the debate is, as I tried to explain, to a large extent very ill-posed.
I think it's also important to note on the biotechnology side, biotechnology is not just genetic modification. There's a lot of work on marker-assisted breeding and selection and bioinformatics and so forth. And China's really far along with that. It's very, very impressive. Other
Did you want me to address them?
Yeah.
I thought that was just important. I mean, I thought it was, we had this little talk this morning. And I think it's, I'm not an expert on China's involvement in Africa. We've been asked a number of times to take a more active role and develop a research program. It's, to be honest, it's quite overwhelming. But we started. So Ji-Kun and I, this is my partner, we went to the Ministry of Commerce, that is China's USAID. So they are the ones who run China's aid program. And the purpose of our visit was to try to understand how they're planning on allocating China's overseas aid money to Africa. And when we sat there, it was extremely frank conversation. And basically what we were told was, we're told by the Party Secretary General Xi Jinping, or Hu Jintao before, you're going to spend $8 billion in Africa this year. And then the Ministry of Commerce says, well, we have zero presence in Africa as the Ministry of Commerce. So, and we have no ability to execute this aid money. So what they do is they go through a decision-making system process where they say, we're going to give, for example, $1 billion to agriculture, $2 billion to building roads, $1 billion to health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now they then call in the ministry, so the Ministry of Agriculture gets told, here's $1 billion, go spend it in Africa. Now the Ministry of Agriculture turns around and says, we have no presence in Africa. There is no USAID. There's no infrastructure at all to spend that. So what they do is, and he says, this is what we did. This is a 5-year recollection. He says, we looked at Africa, and there were about 30 countries in there. There were actually 45. I wrote that down. About 30 countries there. China has 30 provinces. What we're going to do is we're going to take every province and assign them one country. And they say, well, Guangdong is down near the south. Let's give them South Africa. Zhejiang is over to the east. Let's give them Kenya. And they did a matching like this. And then they called in the provincial departments of agriculture and said, everybody gets $50 million. You're going to spend that in your country. And from there, of course, the Department of Agriculture is even more baffled. They say, we don't know anything about Africa. So what they do is they look in their agricultural university, and they found typically a retired professor or a group of professors, and they say, here, go design a program to spend this money. And they end up going to the embassies, the consulates inside each country, and there's no agriculture attaché. There's nobody that has any agriculture, but there's one person that has a hat that 20% of the time, and they work through that person to brainstorm and say, why don't we teach them to do fruits and vegetables? Why don't we do an irrigation project? Or let's do rice in Gambia or something like that. And so it's a totally idiosyncratic process that goes on. I have a grad student who's in the World Bank who's helping China spend this, and he basically has visited 5 of the southern countries in South Africa and said there's one vibrant program. The other 4 programs are almost doing nothing. You know, they're building a compound and doing extension, how to grow fruits and vegetables. And then, you know, they bring people in to look at them. It's very, in fact, now there's two lessons that. One is they're wasting a lot of money. That's a big opportunity cost. The other thing is it's not the Chinese government who's doing all the bad stuff in Africa towards land grabs, and that is not the investment money that's not the Chinese aid money. There are private entrepreneurs who are going in there and buying land, but that's not a concerted, planned effort by the Chinese government. I mean, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to perhaps do good if they can, you know, get their act together. But as of now, it's an ineffective, totally sort of a window dressing program that is just implemented. So I think it's opportunity lost, but I don't think they're doing a great deal of harm.
Yeah, can I say, it's an opportunity lost, but in a sense, there's a room for people like you or for people who came from the land-grant colleges or from the CGIAR. This is like saying that there are no institutions in Africa, which is wrong, right? There are lots of institutions in Africa which you can bring in as partners. There are regional, there are very strong regional organizations. There are regional agricultural organizations. There's the NEPAD with the CADEP. You have national universities. There are most countries, Uganda, Senegal, have very strong national research organizations, the so-called NARS, right? So I think that maybe the China experts, right, coming from the ministries that are going to relate to the Ministries of Agriculture are not sufficiently informed as to what is the kind of institutional landscape that currently exists in Africa. But to assume it away is certainly not the way of doing it, right?
I agree 100%.
Yep.
There's a question over here. And if you could introduce yourself quickly.
My name's John Cannon. Great talks, thank you both. You mentioned, Scott, the difficulty of finding young people in the rural countryside. That sounds like a big problem from a labor standpoint, as China continues to grow and need to feed itself. Is that something that mechanization and technology is going to take care of, and what else is China doing to face that problem? And then on the Africa side, obviously you still have high birth rates in rural Africa. You don't have the urbanization on the scale that you're seeing in China, maybe, but if Paul Collier, things go that way, we will. And so, what can China or what can Africa take from these problems that China is facing?
I'll do the first part. Thanks for the question. I mean, the labor flowing out and of the rural areas and being basically gone, you see it, right? It's rising wages. That's going to have profound impacts for agriculture. And there's two things that are going to happen. One is exactly what you said. There's going to be substitution of machines and technologies for labor. And it's happened. It's happened very fast. Mechanization is underway, and it's working. And you don't see hardly any drop of output, along this process. There's perhaps a little bit. What they end up doing is they end up putting fertilizer is also a substitute for labor, so they're putting enormous amounts of fertilizer to replace labor. This has environmental consequences, which is a very serious issue that's going to have to be dealt with. So from that point of view, that it's not a immediate food security problem. However, this only works on a share of China's land. I mean, China was not endowed with a lot of high-quality cultivated land. If you look at maps of China, it's almost all, except in the delta regions, all mountainous. It would, in a WTO regime where you are facing world market prices, those hilly, very difficult mountainous areas that are now being cultivated won't be cultivated at $4 or $5 an hour, and when wages hit that, within the next 10 years. So there's going to be a big chunk of land that's going to go out of production. There's just going to be no way. They're going to put trees in, perhaps orchards, but probably forests, and it's going to be New England, right? It's like New England used to be the heart of our agriculture area. So it is going to affect food security, and I think that that China will. They've become a net importer. if you don't count the textile. They're going to become a big importer. Now, China takes it really seriously. If you know, there's a lesson there is that they're going to do as much as they can to stop becoming reliant on world food markets to a great degree. There's a lesson that gets passed around through every meeting, and that's don't forget what happened to Japan in World War II, right? The West starved them to death. That's how they think of food security. They don't want to be vulnerable to. So if things really start to go south in imports, I think you'll start seeing them using their subsidies to distort, to actually pay people to plant those marginal areas, and then we're going to get into a WTO fight. But so.
Elaine?
I think it's a good idea to raise the labor issue. One of the main, and you had this in your slides, sources of impoverishment in the rural sector in Africa has been the fall in farm size. And so you have basically three options out of it. If you want to reduce poverty by increasing access to land for those who are going to remain behind, number one, you can increase land area. Now we know that there are many areas which are still very much underused. The large farm sector is coming in. Why is it not the small farm sector which is moving in, right? For this, you need to have infrastructure, you need to have the right kind of assistance, but you can combat this decline in farm size. It's very hard in India. India is going through the same situation, but there's no other land where to go to, right? So what you have to do is get people out of agriculture. But in this case, you still have a frontier that you can capture, but who is going to capture it? Small farms or large farms? For the moment, it's the large farms that are coming in, but there is an option to have the small farms occupy that space. Second, what you can have, and that's what's fascinating in your presentation, the raw non-farm economy, diversify source of income, not have labor go to the urban sector as much as have other economic activities come into the rural areas to create those employment opportunities without having to move to the urban environment, right? And this in Africa is something which is very incipient, right? There has been little effort at decentralization. There is a lack of infrastructure. Foreign direct investment tends to go to the capital cities or to the harbor cities. Right? And the third is employment in kind of the urban environment as opposed to accumulating labor in the slums, right? And I think here the issue is not so much employment opportunities as employability of labor, right? That you go to Senegal, well, labor is too expensive, and labor is not sufficiently trained, and is not sufficiently disciplined, right? So for indirect investment, you have a wonderful harbor, which is one of the most proximus to Europe, and it's empty of containers. Why is that the case? Well, because foreign direct investment is not attracted by this, and probably labor is one of the main reasons in the vision of Justin Lin as to why the industries which are now looking for other opportunities to find cheap labor are not going to those environments. So the third dimension, in a sense, is employability. And employability is skills, is labor legislation, is the power of the unions, and in a sense, the organizations of the labor markets in such a fashion that you can deliver labor in the right condition, the right conditions to this foreign direct investment sector which is coming in.
Question right here in the middle. We just have a few more questions, so unfortunately, but let's take.
Paul Boxer, visiting scholar at Civil and Environmental Engineering. In response to Scott's most recent comments, thank you, and Alain for further research. One thing that I've noticed both in foreign scientific literature and Chinese literature is that there's small but incipient interest among private Chinese and African groups for joint research. I think in the article in Science was referred to David Lobel's work. I don't know.
He's here.
Yeah, I think there was some reference there to foreign scientists working with Chinese scientists, and I think in areas like employment, in market, and it's very important to emphasize these kinds of not state-run, but maybe within the initiative of the Chinese embassies in African countries to get this going. Research and sharing information. Trying to understand what adaptation of Chinese methods for water engineering, which I You know, that's very important, and it's been emphasized. But it's just beginning. Africans are just beginning. Chinese and Africans are beginning to think about what does a Chinese approach mean in African terms, you know, in terms of environmental impacts, and a lot of other areas. Okay, let me share this.
Okay,
I mean, I think that there needs to be joint work together. I think there needs to be a lot of commitment to learning about, you know, China learning the Africa situation and not just blind transfer of technology. And so I think these things might be very good, but I think it's a long-term investment, and I think it's not a natural thing that can just be done off the cuff.
Okay. One more question, Rachel.
Short question. It'll probably take longer to get the microphone. I was just wondering if there was any spatial variation in the total factor productivity growth in China, and if so, does that spatial variation have any particular insight to offer to Africa? Maybe some differences in institutions between regions.
Yeah, there's variance by crop. Certainly, there's differences by provinces. Actually, we never looked at that. That's kind of an interesting idea. I think what China made the commitment was to try to eliminate as much of the spatial variation, especially through markets, right? And let the private sector do that, and instead of trying to plan it, and instead of trying to you know, so seeds are delivered by seed markets, and fertilizer delivered by fertilizer markets, you know, et cetera, and that there's no sort of massive plan out there to do that. I would say that's not a huge factor, because it's one country versus 45. You know, I think that that there's not a lot of sort of lessons right there. No?
I think the question is interesting, because should you build on the best, or should you go to the margins, in a sense? And the problem with foreign assistance and NGOs, they like to go to the margins. They like to go to where people are poor and need assistance. And when in fact, from an African growth perspective, what you want to do is build on what is going to be most successful most rapidly. Now, there's going to be a trade-off between efficiency and equity, right? Because your margins are going to be lagging behind. People are going to be seizing opportunities. Inequality is likely to rise. Inequalities have boomed in China as a consequence, in the sense of this sort of rapidly developing opportunities that people have been able to seize. But I think in Africa, we have been too much held by the issue of kind of poverty, the margin. Smallholder farmers all have to be given a chance. Forget it, right? That's not the way in which growth is going to be sustained in agriculture. You have to build on the best. You have to start investing in the areas where you can have supply response. Then you should also, you know, worry as to how this is going to link to the rest. Are people going to move into those areas? Is the frontier of technology of TFP growth going to be expanded towards the marginal areas? But we need to have a kind of resolution of this conflict between building on the best and being always concerned with sort of the poverty and the extreme poverty issues. And those are, we have to recognize, somewhat in conflict with one another. I believe that without growth, we are not going to go anywhere. Growth is happening in Africa, but as we have seen, it's kind of fragile and incomplete. We should really build on the best first, and then have a social policy which is going to accommodate how this growth is going to filter and incorporate more people.
It's a great vision. Yeah, it's a great way to sort of wrap up. Do either of you want to, Scott, make any additional comments? I don't want to keep people from drinking, but I also don't want to keep people from talking, and I'd like to invite all of you to a reception and continue talking with our speakers, but especially to thank the speakers. It's been a great set of talks and a great conversation. Thank you.